Okay, so for this chapter, we're gonna do some shader setup and introduction to the Nexus, which is our shader that we'll be using in this production. It's acts like a regular shader, actually. As you can see, we've got all our color and our subsurface and bump mapping. It has ambient occlusion, specular, all your basic stuff. But the key to this shader is that it will render everything out into frame buffers. All of those different channels that you saw will be rendered into different frame buffer, and it's almost transparent. It'll just do it. There's no real setup involved. It's quite a awesome package. It was created by Chad Dombrova, and he's a genius. But we'll be releasing this with the DVD, a light version that has almost all the capabilities, and everybody's going to love it. But for this project, I'm going to use it to be splitting out all of my passes so that we can do some visual development. Right now, I'm just hooking up the basic stuff, the bump map, the specular map, and the color map, and as well as a displacement map. All of this stuff we already have created, so it's simply just plugging to a Nexus and setting up a scene. The scene is going to be pretty much the same thing that we did earlier, just a couple lights, and this one's actually going to have an IBL, which is pretty simple, just HDRI. Right now I'm changing the ambient occlusion features of the shader. The way it works is it creates an additional pass which is added onto the diffuse, and that pass is comes from whatever environment contribution is in the scene. So that would be your IBL, either a texture or an image file, whichever you choose. So I changed some settings there, so a little bit of specular settings, pretty simple stuff, really simple to use. This scene I set up with a little bit of a pose onto the head, just so that it has some different angles on all the different forms. It's not just a straight shot, but it's the same mesh. And some render settings we'll go over real quick. I always use, I think I mentioned this before, I always use 02, and pixel filtering I use Mitchell. And that will give you the best quality for the time. I'm going to use Final Gather in this render, just a low setting, and I think I'm going to put on secondary diffuse bounce. It's nice for skin because it adds a softness in some of the corners, a little more value. I'm going to set it back to HT720, which is our res. Turn off default lighting real quick. This is the tab for the Nexus and the render globals. This tells the Nexus what to render out into separate layers. You've got a lot of stuff in there, but we're just going to use the default settings for now. In the compositing or lighting portion of this project, it'll extensively go into that shader and its capabilities. But for now, we're just going to use its basic capabilities, which are to split out the basic passes, such as your specular, your diffuse, your color, your ambient, just the basic stuff. Right now, I'm just doing a simple 3-point lighting system. I use spotlights just because they're fast and simple. Depending on project, you can use any light you want. Sometimes area lights are really good for skin because they're very soft. But I'm just going to set some basic light settings so that it's not completely grainy. I'm going to create another light. This one will probably be our fill or our rim. Just coming from the side to get a little bit of information the side of the head. Yeah, I'm just going to call that rim. And then I'll add one more light, I think. I usually do three lights, but it's not always necessary. With if you have good ambient, you don't need a bounce or a fill usually, but doesn't hurt to have it in there. It's all going to be dialed in comp anyway. You can take it completely out after the fact if you need to, or dial it way up if you like it. Doesn't really matter. I usually like to throw it down in front of him so that I get a little bit of light underneath his chin so that it's not completely black. Now I'm changing the intensities of these lights, but it's not really an issue because the intensity can be controlled in compositing, which we'll see shortly, because we're going to take this in once it's rendered into Shake and start playing with it. So the purpose of all this setup is to create an output that we can do a quick visual development in Shake with. And really explore the asset. I'm just setting up an IBL. These are the options that I take off. All you really need is the visible environment and visible in Final Gather. And I have an image that I'm going to use for that. I'm just going to paste it in here. It's just a simple HDRI. The trick for HDRI, well, if you're doing an actual shot, you match the lights to the HDRI. But at this point, I'm just matching the environment to the lights because I already kind of set up a light that I like. So it's not completely accurate, but it's just to give us a little bit of information in the ambient pass. But at this point, I'm not really worried about matching anything. It's purely visual development, and we really wanted to see where this asset can go, what it's capable of, and how it responds to the different passes. So the next step here is to create a subsurface, which is fairly simple. I'm just going to take a regular fast skin Maya and take out the diffuse and take out the specular. We're just looking to get the in the screen composite. We're just looking to get the core subsurface properties. You want to make the the texture twice the width and the height and 32-bit. That'll ensure a good light map. So the way that we hook up this is to simply take the subsurface shader and plug it into the subsurface slot in the Nexus, which we'll see in a second. And by putting it in the subsurface slot, the Nexus knows how to add that to the shader. And we can also preview it. So in order for this to be complete, we need to hook up a light map to the shader group and to the texture. So now our subsurface is hooked up. Pretty basic setting. Pretty seamless into the Nexus. So now that we have that hooked up, we can take a look at the render view. It's slightly modified for this. It's part of the Nexus package. You'll see that we have some different options. I'm going to take displacement off for some of these test renders, but you'll see that there's some bars on the side, on the top. Right now I'm selecting a preview for subsurface, and that way I can take the subsurface portion of the shader and just render that. And you can do that for any portion of the map. and we'll preview some more shortly. But right now, let's just kind of tweak the subsurface into something that's going to work. As you saw, the first portion of the or the first render of the subsurface was horrible. It's because the radius is way too high, and you'll see that people make that mistake a lot, and they think they're getting subsurface, but they're not. That's getting a little better, but it's still too water balloon. You don't want the subsurface to completely obliterate your diffuse shading. The scale conversion is just a divider. It'll divide the current values of the subsurface by that number. So I basically just took my values and divided them in half. Maya only will display 3, so if you really want to have smaller numbers, then it's good to do a scale factor and divide all your values in half, and then just tweak from there. But so now I'm just kind of changing some settings of the subsurface based on what I see. I'm trying to tighten the radius down so that there's not as much blur, but there's still enough to give it a soft look, and increasing the saturation a little bit. All of that can be tweaked in comp as well. So it's basically just to get the proper fall off on the light map. The key settings for the overall skin look is the first 2 layers. The backscatter is clear only for backlighting mostly. Whenever there's a light behind the surface, it'll start to punch through the surface, whereas the other ones are more of like the overall scatter within the skin from any angle. So let's just take a look at the different passes. We can render all of the diffuse lights, or just any a particular diffuse light if you just want to see how that light is responding. So this is the diffuse currently. Pretty basic. We can take a look at the let's do the specular, and that's the specular. Now at this point it doesn't matter if your values are hot, because we'll be rendering to 16-bit for this project, and that's just added information. Here's the color map in its current state. Do some ambient. Ambient's a little blotchy. I'm not too concerned about it. It's just from the high contrast and the HDRI. But so if we want to go ahead and output all of those passes that we just saw, we're going to do the output mode. And you can see it will render a beauty, as you see on screen. And it looks kind of ugly, but it's just the core passes. I'm not worried about how it looks in the render view. And you can see here in the output render preview here that it wrote all of the passes for the shader. So now we got Shake loaded up, and just gonna hook these up and preview our model. You can see we got all the speculars, the diffuse, every pass that the Nexus outputs by default is in here. I'm going to start with the diffuse. The diffuse passes are the different lights, so we got them broken out by each light. We got key, rim, and bounce. And the way that the light passes are treated is they're added. So anything that comes from a light source of any sort is additive. So we're going to add all of these together using the iAdd node. The bounce was never intended to be that high. So we're going to just do a brightness node and take that brightness down to something rather low. I'm getting a little black in the underside, so we might bring it up just a little bit. We'll have the ambient to fill those out as well. So that's the ambient subsurface color, and then our specular passes. Our specular passes are treated the same way as the diffuse, added together. And these come from the same lights, so we want to do the same, to the most part, do the same color corrections to the same passes. So if I do a brightness to the bounce, I want to do a brightness to the bounce of the specular as well. So I just copied that and I'm going to paste it in there. So now we have our diffuse and our specular combined. So the next thing we want to do is take our ambient pass and link it up to the diffuse pass. So since the ambient is coming from the environment, technically light from the environment, that's going to be added as well. Now the pre-multiply was turned off in the Nexus globals. So what that means is that any value that you set in your shader is going to be ignored and everything's going to be outputted as 1. So if you put a value of 0.2 in your ambient, then just make a brightness node and do a 0.2 on that, and it'll be very similar. So you can see the ambient contribution here. I put it in fairly subtle. So next we're going to do the subsurface. The subsurface is treated slightly different. It's not just a simple add. What we want to do is invert the subsurface and then multiply it against the diffuse. What that does is it takes out any additive light information so that the subsurface is correctly added to. It's not stacked, is what we're doing. We don't want to stack the subsurface to be double lighting. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's the best way to do it. It's a little abstract, but it's accurate. So you'll see here that the subsurface is coming in properly. And there's no clipping of values or additive light. The color is going to be multiplied against that. Pretty much the only multiply that happens in the tree. The rest are just for tweaking passes. Our light information is a little strong. It's getting flattened out in certain areas, so we might be able to take down the ambient a little bit. It's a little bright right in there. Just tweak the brightness nodes so that it brings it back into a little bit of range. The information is going to be described a lot as well by the specular. The forms are going to be described by that. So the specular right now is being it's going to be modified by the specular map, which has been broken out in this control pass. It hasn't been baked into the actual specular pass, so we need to add that in as well. And then the reflection also needs to be modified before we can add it. So we're going to multiply this specular by the control pass once we break it out. Now I've made a mistake and accidentally multiplied the specular by the reflection, but we'll fix that. Right now I just want to break out the Fresnel portion of this pass, which is the facing ratio aspect of it. And this will help us correctly composite in the reflection. So the reflection needs to be multiplied, or this needs to multiply against the reflection so that the reflection is only coming in on the glancing angle and not so much on the front. You're going to want a little bit in the front, but that's just for the oiliness, and it doesn't need to be too strong. So I'm still modifying this pass so that I can multiply it against the reflection. And I'm just going to do a multiply and multiply it against the reflection. So it's hard to see here, but when we add it all together, you'll see it. Now the mistake is apparent here, but we'll get back to it and fix that. Right now I want to add, do an add node. When you have your two trees complete, your specular and your diffuse and color, you want to add them together, and that will be pretty much the core of the network. That's how it's all combined. And I'm not seeing any spec because of this hookup, so I'm taking this and I'm going to multiply it by the reorder or the brightness node. And then I'm going to add the result of that reflection onto my specular. So we can kind of see the specular and reflection coming in. The reflection is very slight, but that's the basic construction of your asset, and it's very easy to preview and tweak things. I've made another comp with much more interesting things happening, but I just want to compare where it could go. This is the old one, and then this here is one that I've played with for a little bit, right there. And that one has some facing ratio, as you can see, kind of a peach fuzz, more involved subsurface, just some little tricks that you can do. And this is all done in comp and can be done in the final shot. So in the next chapter, we're just going to make a cigar.